Hello everyone, today we talk once again about medieval mercenaries, and this time more specifically about the centuries 11 to 13th, to, add a bit of maybe just quantitative data about the pace, but also especially to look at certain aspects of mercenarism, the way it's been imagined in a way, and what we can understand it was concretely. And we already addressed in a way the topic of medieval mercenarism and also a bit of this myth, especially the one of the scarce, better the unreliability of mercenaries, right, altogether compared to other levies, whether they were the feudal ones or the hairband or these things. We'll see how naturally this is mostly a 19th century myth, right? Even though some of you pointed out, time I say that, that it seems Machiavelli that there are these issues with mercenaries. Yes, but there is also, the issue is sometimes subtler than in actual terms, as the question doesn't go much towards the reliability of mercenaries themselves. In certain contexts where objectively, yes, they were unreliable, but really, and that's what we should measure the thing on the base on, the reliance of the rest of the troops. Machiavelli, for example, had an agenda, and he was also, he was definitely, as you know, one of the greatest authors in the history of modern Europe. He wrote an astonishing amount, not just a great quality, but an astonishing quantitative amount of works, tracing definitely what we start seeing as a Renaissance mind, right? In previous centuries, the attitude towards war and also the way it was described was very different. Machiavelli wrote the Art of War, the Prince, etc. He had a very statalistic and also authoritative perspective fundamentally about what the nature of power had to be. And he was mostly lamenting in his own kind, in a sort of hypercritical way, as from the Florentine perspective, about the essentially the unreliability of the condotte, right? As in Italy, this system had fundamentally spread, the mercenarism had spread in a more systematic way than other countries, for two reasons essentially, that are the great political fragmentation and the great wealth of the Italian peninsula. That is also the best combination for every rapacious power that is definitely way more robust, say at that point France and Spain, to actually enter. And the issue there was the illusion that those Italian city-states could, that they still were, even if they were fundamentally on a regional scale at some point, they would be capable to invest from essentially a commercial mindset background in many ways on a permanent military force, right? That nobody had interest to do, especially an armed militia that, however, the war civility were presenting as a necessity against the arms of the Swiss, of the Spanish, of the French, that were all developing their own way, essentially in the Swiss model, as we know. But even think about the Germans, the Landsknecht, and so on. This thousands of armed no ones, because that's what they were. They were essentially proletarians. They were, they weren't people in arms. Not even in case of the Swiss at the end of the day. Because that began as a people in arms, then they probably became mercenaries, going explicitly against the laws of the Confederative, the Helvetic Confederacy. And in Europe, so Machiavelli is an exception, but in the rest of Europe, yes, there might have been, I don't know honestly, I never read too much of it, but I don't know. For example, mercenarism was quite widespread, famously enough, in Germany. Germany was a land that had exported, or even just for economical and demographic reasons, right? It was generally poorer than other places, but it had this pretty massive demographic capacity at that time, and it had become a land of mercenaries. And I don't know much of a kind of a German lamentation because of mercenary, which surely existed right? But for example, it was in very different terms from Italy. It was already thinking through kind of a unitary lens, while Germany was mostly the land of princely rules, also with very difficult boundaries and different ethnicities and so on. So it's complex, but the real awareness, right? The real, think even of the French. The French, we've made the videos in there that tried in their political and social reality to create essentially a French infantry force with this semi-permanent or even permanent status at that point. They had tried that. They had keep trying for a long time. They constantly failed, basically up to the mid-16th century. And throughout all the time, they used essentially Swiss infantry. So even in there, surely there was a rhetoric. There was, why should we pay these guys that actually are foreigners that drain French money from the country? But however, a great advantage of the Swiss is that once you had actually used them, that they would come back to their own country, which was an advantage in many ways because of the cost of maintaining a permanent force. But the Renaissance is surely a moment in history where this, let's say, modern attitude to say we need national armies starts to appear. But it's just the 19th century in many ways, in my opinion, at least as far as I've read that, is expressing this bias, this very negative opinion of the mercenary, not just as an unreliable guy or as a cost, an expensive one, but explicitly as a sort of betrayer of the fatherland, which of course is total bullshit, as it's always been historically speaking in every context. First of all, because mercenaries throughout all military history, I mean, if they exist and they are used, it's because they freaking work, and how the hell they work. And secondly, because even in here in the comparison, national militias are absolutely not as reliable as a military force as a mercenary professional one is, right? It's no strange thing if, I don't know, the French still at the time of the revolution had Swiss and German guards and not French ones, even though they had basically the hegemonic army in Europe for it, the most updated at many levels. That's also a different reality where, of course, the national armies is still standing. But the idea that you basically take all what works, very often in conditions where you can't actually do otherwise, it is true, but at the same time, if you can't do otherwise, it's because the others are basically doing the same thing, right? Look at the Middle Ages, which today we talk about, and I'm thinking specifically even just of late, but also the early modern age. I mean the late Middle Ages, but also the early modern age. It's the apex of mercenaries. Think about Wallenstein. Think about, some of the greatest commanders even that had risen through the ranks as for. And what's the deal with mercenarism, too? Right, the term mercenary is also loaded with this negative meaning and stigma. Semantically speaking, we say mercenary. Maybe today it's become a bit more, common use, that it has lost a bit that heavy, grave, let's say, tone of the term. But when you compare it with its actual equivalent, which is the same exact identical thing, that is a soldier, because that's what it means. You immediately, you see there the etymology of mercenaries, mercenary that is highlighted. That there is a person essentially that is making sort of a business, right, out of the duty of soldiery, which is something that in itself makes no distinction at all, because every soldier that ever existed, in the sense, he's paid, and he does that because otherwise it wouldn't be effective, right? Soldiers, you say that all soldiers are mercenaries, that would be an insult to giving the term that we give to mercenary, but literally every single mercenary is a soldier, and technically we're talking about the same identical thing, and there is nothing more effective than a paid trooper, right? Which is also another thing that shouldn't be given for granted, especially in the measure in which these until the nation state, the pay for these troops was very often not a big deal, right? We see throughout all the Middle Ages, modern age, the idea that which reflected the broader level of development of those cultures, let's say, that lived, can say, barely over the survival rate, but largely something close to that. So the income that a normal person had in those times, aside also from war, which had commensurate costs in that sense, was enough just to survive mostly, and not much else, right? There were people that naturally made a business out of it, but mostly with risks that might have not been completely worth, and with a ferocious competition that emerges exactly from the centuries we are analyzing today, which are very useful to understand, in fact, why mercenaries exist and why they are not actually a negative thing, but a positive one, right? If you're thinking through a political, social, military point of view, they're essentially the best solution, that essentially also a wealthier system, unlike the early medieval one was, at least in relative terms here, is able to provide. You have more people around that are, essentially have had more possibilities to gain military experience, to train, to keep themselves. They sell their service on the market. You have them, they're there. They're already trained, which means that largely you have nothing to do with the costs associated, both to their training and to their disbandment. After the disbandment, you don't have to maintain them, if not during the service itself. So they are an immediate advantage, right? There are many ways you can say that mercenaries appear at this time. That's another picture we have, in fact, mostly associated, I would say, to the Middle Ages, because we have, especially about the 14th century, this terrible picture, the idea, this soldiers of fortune that ravaged Europe, there's ferocious animals and all this stuff that turn upside down basically every single place out there, any major country in Europe. And the question here is, it's a myth, it's a historiographical myth. I mean, the violence of 14th century warfare is very difficultly put in perspective, given the as in relative terms, the broader cynetic forces that existed in medieval Europe. Absolutely no more, no less violent than in the past or in the future, right? That's actually the first moment in which naturally there were unbalances that produced these terrible things to happen. But you can't look, just at feudal warfare, if it ever existed in its, as we will see it, in relative to the mercenary problem, or even to early medieval times, and see, that was a less ferocious or ruthless or, not based on convenience system than before. That's bollocks. You can't say that, historically speaking. And in fact, an aspect that is very often underestimated, and this also is due to the general, lack of documentation in certain historical times, is that mercenaries have always existed in the core essence of what they are in every single historical period. Like, there's not a moment, like we mostly associate once again with the kind of the Hellenistic era, right, mostly, because the Roman Empire basically swallows everything and transforms them into auxilia, which were technically also the same thing, just more framed into a civil system of reward, service and reward, and so on, but with broader political and social accomplishments. In fact, medieval mercenarism is very different from this point of view, and it would be very interesting to study it in these terms. I mean, mercenaries, whatever you want to look at them like, weren't absorbed apparently from a political, social point of view in medieval Europe. Basically, they were mostly foreigners in some cases, at least the majority of them, that it's not that went to another country to settle down there, right? Those times of migration era were over, right? Certain dynamics are basically the same, right? It's difficult not to see, for example, in the German broader militarized reality that the Middle Ages, with dynamics of this East still in the, in turmoil, without defined frontiers, with a strong kind of individual edus and so on, and the export of their mercenaries, something common objectively with waves of Germanic peoples in historical times, right? Certain dynamics do remain the same, also because these societies are still pre-industrial ones. They have major macroscopic dynamics that are a bit still the same, right? Remember, I think it was during the First Crusade or Second, when there was the appeal to the Germans that said, this classical stereotypes, but that reflected apparently also certain demographic realities of this fact of this numerous youth that was always brave and went around fighting, was warlike. Stereotypes, prejudices, up to a certain point though, because personally I'm studying the thing from the 14th century, and we'll have to make videos about that. There's a striking German moral force about, in their mercenarism. They were mostly cavalry, right? Another fascinating thing here is that certain countries were basically about those specialties. We'll see them now. But they didn't have this dramatic collective discipline like other countries might have had. In fact, they were fundamentally contained in many cases by the same people who hired them. It's not that they came out much out of control. Actually, even the myth, for example, during the Italian Middle Ages, was taking over of the English White Company was a hell of a collectively trained thing. The others, more or less, and it was mostly the Italian powers that sent them against each other. So it's not that they ever took over or settled, or So that's a very interesting perspective. At some point we'll have to take. Today we can't talk about it, but there are some certain specific characters, military cultures, attitudes that you can't get also from the origins of these mercenaries. I don't remember where I got to this point, but what I was saying, is that mercenaries had always existed, right? If you look at early medieval Europe, there were many. They were habitual, right? How many Vikings fought for the Franks, or even Franks fought for the Vikings? Freely. And I really mean it. And for specific interests, to damage even their own, say, connationals, because of reasons that are evidently, were evidently more important systematically at that time than whatever the 19th century historiographical myth of the nation and this other unfortunate delusions have come to across in our mind. It's not that there weren't such gluing factors. It's that there were many others that were sometimes basically the same thing. But the idea broadly is that there is a development in these centuries, especially the 11th, 13th. I made a video recently exactly about this topic. So maybe for the broader picture we can't get to that point, get to that video, and that's it, this broader introduction. Today we talk about just a bunch of other things, as I was saying in the beginning. So, first of all, it's difficult to define even what, in relation to the broader feudal terms in the feudal military system, a mercenary was. Because, for example, the mercenary substitutes hired with revenue obtained from scutage, right, were sometimes the same people, or at least, they were involved at certain local levels by, but within the same armies. What does this mean? It means that more, what the scutage is basically that you would pay some money just for sending someone else to go fight. This was also absolutely normal in all the ages. Like, there's never been a moment in history which literally every free able-bodied man was sent to war, right? Not even during the migration year, right? Or at least not with the same organizational forms. And also because this would exhaust the local production, right? This was a system which took away all, let's say, the majority of the people, let's say, would collapse agriculturally speaking. We see it since early medieval times, even since late Roman times. I mean, it's there in every single cultured society. What I'm saying here is that there were sometimes noblemen from the same place, because that's also what happened often, is that this time we see mostly the rise of infantries, which is a true thing, but we often forget that the rise of infantry doesn't mean that throughout all the Middle Ages the infantries took over systematically, right? There was never such a thing. As you know, I insisted very much in the first half of the 14th century, where objectively there is a astonishing series of infantry victories, but fundamentally it ends there, right? You have to wait another 100 years before you have something comparable and actually more advanced than that. Surely infantries do increase their own relative importance, but cavalry is at the core of the thing. And the real problem with mercenaries really is in fact not much getting a certain type of trooper, right? Or at least not completely. Or better, there was no overturn in the spread of mercenarism with the normal tactical ratio, right? Up to a certain point, or if there was, I would go as far as saying that it was actually at the benefit of cavalry, largely meant. Now we'll see why. Most of these mercenaries, what were they? They were knights. They were men-at-arms, whatever you want to call them. We're talking about the full, heavily armored guy that cannot be distinguished also in any way from any other knight at that time, both for training, sometimes even for extraction. Right, by the 11th century, becoming a knight naturally is much easier than becoming it in the 13th. So there is a trend that shows fundamentally the increase also of social sclerotization, especially starting from the 14th century. That's pretty evident, and that's what partly also probably contributed to the increase of infantry force at some level for different reasons, but still as a reaction to this increasingly as a cause and a consequence altogether, actually, of the increasingly heavying of cavalry force. Because if you look technically at the 13th century knight, before plate armor would start its journey to eventually arrive to cover entirely the knight by the end of the Middle Ages, you can't say that there were dramatic differences in equipment, say, from Carolingian times, right? The major changes had occurred mostly at a collective level. That is, how many resources these guys had in training, which naturally was the single most important thing. It wasn't how heavily armored they were, also because that has a cost. You can't be low. Already the 13th century knight had serious impediments, especially in terms of visual, in terms of physical exertion, right? You know, it's not that armor was heavy in the way we intended, that they couldn't move, because they could brilliantly move in armor. It's just that it's exhausting. So you can't do it, but just for a contained time. The point, though, is that there are more people that can join from the bottom in this regard. But from the 14th century, surely there is an increase, especially crossbow power that matured actually since the 11th. The crossbow actually never disappeared during the early medieval times either. There is a revival, there are more effective technologies, but especially infantry also grows as an important thing, and firearms that really accelerate the process of waning of the medieval armor. I'm not cutting infantry out, generally speaking, out of this, but let's say that infantry importance is always that thing. It should be calibrated case by case, and let's say that indeed in the most developed countries in Europe, infantry had a greater importance, was starting to be. If you look at the 100 Years' War, that's very important, for example, as we know. But even in there, we should distinguish what it is concretely. The English men-at-arms, but even the longbowmen, were technically all cavalry, right? Dismounted cavalry. So even in there, what are we talking about? What is infantry, right? Is that a rabble of angry peasants or commoners that fight for their own freedom. Not much, actually. In the 14th century, in fact, is exactly in the middle of it, the crisis of the subordinate classes. They're wiped out, especially the peasantry, and also the middle classes of the city-states become ever more oligarchic in nature. So, no, we can't really say that. But there is an actual indicator that we can get from mercenarism about the not so huge importance of infantry by certain standards that we'll see why. But first of all, it is a tactical one. That is, the mercenary substitutes hired with revenue obtained from the scutage were principally crossbowmen and men-at-arms, right? So, as I was saying before, this scutage was paid literally also by the lord sometimes. That here, I don't think we have to repeat all the nuisance of the of the feudal system, how difficult it was to call these guys to war. It's not that these lords were saying, I want to just live like a rich bastard, not doing anything anymore in my life. That's the parasitic prejudice that we have for unfortunate classist kind of leftist reasons about the terrible oppressors. And the Middle Ages are actually one of the clearest, most limpid evidences of elites that were absolutely pretty damn good at what they were doing, that constantly reinvested all they earned, because otherwise they could have never survived in there, and that fought on their own. That is, maybe the knight that paid that paid a scutage actually was a guy that in his free time spent all the time fighting, right? It's just he didn't want to go to war for the king or whatever. Then naturally there was a process of, could say, I don't even know how to say that, not gentrification because it sounds too, but let's say of pacification. Yes, even the nobility starts, as we've seen, hierarchizing. That is to say that there is a ever higher nobility, so the other guys are kind of taken out of the business. They're minor nobility, they can't participate towards. Sometimes they did as mercenaries, in fact, right? And simply, as we've seen, they could maybe see more advantageous to become a mercenary, maybe for a foreign power, than for their own king. And you know how messed up the situation was, politically speaking, at the time, so there would be nothing strange. But the fact that the majority of powers invested the scutage money in men-at-arms and crossbowmen is a huge deal, in my opinion, that reveals that the main need here was the intensification of cavalry warfare. Now, I will not discuss a topic that is becoming very dear to me, that is essentially what role did infantry have exactly from a tactical point of view on the battlefields, especially towards the 13th century and so on. There's a debate among scholars. Many say essentially that infantry was like in a reserve. Others that actually fought on the flanks. And I'm ever more prone to believe the latter, not just because I found it repeatedly in certain contexts that I've been studying that are also kind of notorious, actually not very much paraded, because I think to any of you the most the greatest example of that is in fact English tactics of the 100 Years' War. Actually, this was common in other parts, at least in a specific region of Europe, much before, at least a good half of a century before, and in pretty damn large armies, and nobody gives a damn about it. And these wings actually could include, they would be literally enclosing cavalry, so they would tunnel it in this central corridor, so that the cavalry would clash frontally in these lines, and being supported on the flanks by this not just crossbowmen. Of course, there was a stopping power there, including mostly lancers, as there was the most common type of warrior at the time, fighter at the time. But especially this idea that you're increasing crossbow power, it means that you're shooting at horses, which notoriously, also because the wide majority of horsemen, horses specifically, not horsemen, were not armored, right? Or at least they had some very light form, or not, doesn't even mean it's ineffective, but like the gambas and so on. But mail for horses is something that you start seeing ever more frequently used since the 13th century. But throughout all, even later centuries, we see that it pertains to an elite because it's astonishingly expansive. It's something incredible. So notoriously, now for any person who has studied low medieval warfare knows that, but also in other contexts, that cavalry is pretty damn vulnerable to crossbows because of the horses, right? The average knight would be covered in iron from head to toe. The horse maybe didn't even have any metal piece, or at least if they had, it was mostly the forehead and the chest. There are interesting, because Western Europe is fairly well documented, even if we can't understand wholly clearly the evolution of armor, metal armor for horses, but we can understand more or less the times. And also there were also boiled leather armor, other stuff, so which iconographically we can't say that, on a seal, on a statue, on a painting. We don't know whether that's metal. Also because everything was painted, everything was colored, every armor was colored mostly. Or at least that's another part of the story that we have tended to forget. But what I was saying here is that yes, there are even other areas of Europe like Hungary where there are Byzantine chronicles to say, the Hungarian knights had, they say it randomly, right? They had breastplates for horses. Then it's just one. It's Niketas Koniates, if I remember correctly, and for a battle for 1167, something like that. And that's just a mention, right? Since we don't find anything like that in Western Europe, one can make all speculations, but it's not even important. The important here is that, structurally speaking, crossbows are pretty damn effective against cavalry, and therefore you had this battle line for which naturally knights would repeat charges over and over again, because that it's rarely one shot, one charge, and you break the enemy. Night battles were this clash of few minutes after the charge, then a lot of time for reforming, regaining, breath, drinking, whatever, restoring, and then launching another charge was repeated until one side collapsed. And in the meanwhile, also because there was a lot of spare time, there would be all these crossbowmen on the flanks that would target each other and the horses during the charge, specifically while in fact the knights were fighting. And the indicator here is quite important because it tells you that this is specifically a functionalized tactic for cavalry warfare, right? To which naturally, especially crossbowmen that are light infantry, skirmishers essentially, they're the skirmishers of the medieval world. That otherwise you don't see much javeliners or slingers around like the ancient era. The crossbows took over, and the concept here is that crossbowman there is in function of cavalry warfare mostly. Then actually the role of crossbows in anti-infantry function is being under-evaluated, overlooked too. There are, especially in those situations where there were habitually strong infantries used to fight against each other, we know that crossbow fire had a dramatic importance to favor the softening up of the formation before cavalry would charge these units. There are interesting examples in Italy, also during the Scottish War of Independence by the English. That's where they began to. We made a video about that, about both these realities, because the English cavalry itself realized they couldn't break through Scottish schiltron, and they softened up. At least initially, the Scots won eventually their independence thanks to the resistance of their infantry, but at the beginning they also suffered important defeat. And so, as you see here, there is a lot going on, where infantry is definitely important, but still money is spent for what? It's spent mainly for cavalry and these missile troops that are becoming ever more effective, ever more functional, ever more deadly. We should talk about for example, who were these mercenaries also in terms of the knightly status? Literally anyone. When you read Miles Milites in a Latin chronicle, you are reading essentially not necessarily knight but horseman, right? And this is typical in Europe, where let's say that there were tough battlefields. Western Europe was a reality where there was a very few, as you know, of light troopers. The exception was a bit in Spain, where with the jinetes, but for the rest, this broader Frankish culture dominates the rest of Europe, is about essentially heavy cavalry and heavy infantry. Heavy infantry in the sense that it can hold the field against cavalry, at least for a while. Then eventually it can't without support of cavalry in turn, but it's still a hard battlefield, right? And this is a bit of an exception, because not all countries outside had similar things. Both because in Western Europe the middle classes were stronger, better equipped, so these militias were sometimes very, very good and very, tough and even aggressive in certain situations. But also, naturally, because it was a wholly sedentarized situation, it was a great, different systems of productivity. In other words, the eastern you go, the lighter you get, especially in terms of light cavalry. But just to make an example, during the Crusades, the typical Seljuk Turkish army is like, a tiny yet ultra-heavy elite of cavalry, and throwaway spare waves, hordes of basically literally unarmored horse archers. If you look at Egypt, at the same time is in the same context, but it's very different from the Turks, the Persianized area in general, and so on. You see that, for example, they have tougher infantries, sometimes coming in from contexts like, Sudan, etc. But even just the native troops of the Ayyubids and so on, they were tougher. They were closer to what the Europeans were, in a way. And this is a characteristic, also because Egypt is, generally speaking, the only power that has, in North Africa, that has this sound land mass power. Yes, Tunisia is a bit like that, Morocco is a bit like that, but generally speaking, North Africa is this stripe, fertile stripe on the coastal areas and some tens of miles inland, but eventually the arid, semi-arid areas begin. So never had kind of a demographic or economical power to invest so much. There were Bedouins, but mostly light troopers, right? Europe is completely different in this. So one consequence that is fascinating to see, and if you study medieval sources, you can also, have fun in the meanwhile to check this, is that you'll hardly find in Western Europe something like properly light cavalry or light infantry. Like crossbowmen aside, that have this dramatic offensive power because of their engines, their bows, their crossbows. There's not such a thing precisely light cavalry. Obviously there was. Obviously there were some runners without armor that pillaged whatever. We know that. We know that. I don't know. If you go to in Hungary or Poland, there were these, steppes peoples that were settled. Sometimes they did that, but they were essentially from the east. They weren't not even countries like Poland or Hungary where they were tough. They were Western, right, in everything. So, or at least they had this slighter ethnic character, but also due to the contact with those people, that essentially it's very hard to find something soft on those battlefields. Soft means also agile, means also missile capable. Ask the Christians at Nicopolis, at Varna. They were kicked out by the Turks that had everything but a strong infantry, but they actually had a hell of cavalry and skirmishers and missile troops in general, so that they were able even to defeat them as disastrously. But still that society worked in this way. I don't know why I got here, but yes, the fact that if you read Miles Milites plural, and you see, yes, they are not knights, they're simple horsemen, but still, in turn, it's still heavy cavalry, right? They're still largely armored troops, right? Then if you read sergeants, things like that, yeah, the squires, those tend to be lighter, but up to a certain point. And in fact, the tendency throughout these centuries to the 13th is that at the end, a squire would be fundamentally equipped just like a knight, right? Even in here, we could go on because the interest, I think, historiographically speaking, especially the passage between the 13th and 14th century is not being explained dramatically well. As you know, by the 14th century there were these things like the barbuta or the lanks and other tactical units would see the appearance still of this bulky, heavy knight with a retinue like just with crossbowmen on horseback. They were naturally lighter, etc. But that's part of a further expansion, right? The idea is that by the 13th century, you read fundamentally still armored, right? And mostly metal armor, trooper on horseback, right? Because there were many that people that would rise from even the humblest strata of the population, made a fortune, or maybe they weren't even poor. On the contrary, they were maybe rich merchants. What they do, they want to become knights, they want to become aristocrats, so they will start fighting exactly in the same way. In fact, I'll go as far as that this is actually pretty notorious, that there is technically no difference whatsoever from Portugal to Poland, from Scotland to Sicily, in European knights, right? You can find maybe, I don't know, a style of arm, I don't know, some other gear, some detailing here, but the essence of it, in terms of training, equipment, whatever, they're utterly identical, and especially by the 14th century, they're identical. By every difference is loose. That there is nothing there. It's completely homogeneous. This makes things easier, actually, because that's also what Europe and what we're talking literally about here is was born in a way. This was a largely homogeneous system. They shared so much in terms of political, military culture at all levels. You can't say that these guys are different than others. Right, there can be, once again, some fighting styles here and there, but the more especially you go towards the 13th to 14th, with the expansion of feudalism, or this feudal-derived system, the thing goes in that direction, and they have the same identical capacities, right? You can find more or less, collectively trained knights, sure, right? There is a reason if the French were considered the best knights in the world, in a way, because they were, but that's because they were Danish society in many ways that had produced them. The rest is an emanation, but in terms also of military technology, armor developments, Europe has this dramatic capacity of spreading everything everywhere in the same way. Helmets, armor, swords, so much that in fact we chronologically speaking, we just put that level, but no real, we can say where a thing emerged, but we know that in a few decades all Europe would have the same, and that tells you how intertwined the system was, by the way. So despite the codes of chivalry by which the knighthood often fought and sometimes lived by, especially at the end of this period, because the 11th century knight was consistently different from a cultural background than the 13th century one. Knights constituted a large percentage of most European mercenaries. Particularly during the 13th century, they were in no way regarded as inferior to their feudal counterparts. And honestly, I've never met, also because from a documentary point of view it's rare for this age, any specific complaint towards mercenarism. I mean, I'm sure there is something in the form of, ideal in fact, chivalric ideals about, you should all only fight for your own lord, for your own dame, and all this stuff. But aside from the fact that exactly fighting for your own lord and your own dame meant sometimes to spend a freaking fortune, there is all a specific entrepreneurial character, literally feudalism, that is often overlooked. That even here, the difference, with mercenaries, it wasn't even properly perceived. I mean, the idea of just monetization of these links, let's call them this way, it was something so natural, so immediate, right? Feudalism, as we've seen, worked essentially with pays. There were certain fiefs that didn't have to provide troops, but money. This is pretty evident in those realities that had also broader. Germany, for example, is well documented at this point. Bishops, for example, usually were faithful to the emperor, sent proper contingents, so much that, most of the Barbarossa armies actually were composed by clergy troops. Not that were ecclesiastics in their way. There were lots of bishops at command. That's something in Central Europe actually has a long tradition, even up to the 14th and beyond. But the more far away fiefs, like let's say the ones in the north of Germany, that usually, as you know, the main houses of the main imperial houses have been, originally was Saxony, but they had problems at that point to wage the Raumfahrt in Italy. But then it went down, right? It went south, Franconia, Swabia. Then there were, eventually there were the Luxembourgs and so on, Austria. But this first century that came later. But in this first centuries up to the 13th, usually there was literally fiefs that, the emperors had given up to be able to impose on them mandatory service. And naturally everybody prepared to pay, because money just think about it, right? Even as we see in accounting in this century, some of the greatest inventions were essentially the letters of exchange. This idea that you don't have to ship the whole freaking thing, trooper included. No, you just have the money with you in the army encampment. Knights would flock at your side as long as you showed that well. It's really how it worked, and this saved an enormous amount of logistical expenses from the sovereigns. That's why it was so freaking effective. And so already by this point, scutage or not, most service was rewarded like that, right? And naturally, everything was negotiated. Everything. There was no categorical separation between the reasons of military service. If you were a particularly loyal servant of the king, for which normally happened for political reasons, that is to say, if the king wins, you also win, and that makes you earn something, you would go just not necessarily for free, but you would simply make your own calculation, and you would behave accordingly. So it's politics essentially you have to look at first. And naturally also a lot of other just territorial problems, but that they are essentially pertaining to society as a whole and how they could mobilize and so on. So even in here, especially up to the 13th century, we do not have much documentation to say, look, the chivalric ideals written at court, or even by the ecclesiastics that were influenced by this, obviously, even in monasteries. There were lots of chronicles were written. It's not that there was once upon a time the golden age where knights truly believed in chivalric vows. That never existed, historically speaking. And as far as we understand, every time we get an information from the otherwise lack of any, from the secular reality, we perfectly realize that this was freaking wild, and that probably there wasn't much of that ideal at any level. Also because the ideal was created in theory to be in fact an ideal, to say, okay, we should stick to that specific model, because society is transforming this way, that's what would be interesting for us to remain, or better, to become tendentially. But we know the reality is completely different, right? It's like today saying, okay, well, let's not make political parallelisms, but whatever you think you fight for, and then you realize what you really fight for. Hypocrisy is normal in human behavior, and it doesn't necessarily mean that sometimes you can't say I fight for money. And the question is, what's wrong fighting with money? I mean, money do not have an intrinsic value in themselves. You obviously fight for money because you want something else. And what do you want? Do you want a house? You want a woman? You want a future? That's it. Go get it. If you have money, you can live better. You can have more opportunities. You can meet more people. You can create your own clientele. That's exactly it. So what's wrong for fighting for money, right? You are not going to marry your money, and especially in this time, this is what I would like to understand. It wasn't this huge divide between social class. Everything was reinvested, right? Reinvested, even if, of course, there was a big divide between classes proper, especially in those feudalized areas that were, in a way, also pioneering this capability of enlisting mercenaries because of the surplus they had. Well, still, the surplus was constantly reinvested. Look at, I don't know, the wars between the Plantagenets and the Capetians, 12th century, 13th century England, France. This is constant war. I mean, there is not a moment in which you say, okay, well, I have some money, let's treasure them. It's immediately spent. Of course, there was some, treasuring in a way, but the point is that basically at every moment, these monarchies were one step away from annihilation, at least their dynasties, and you had to constantly compete by investing or reinvesting, and they were chronically out of money. So much that actually great part of the 13th, 14th century developments also derived from the big money that were starting being made, I don't know, in the city-states, the mercantile republics and so on, that were lent to the major kingdoms that didn't have much of that economic vitality in relative terms to those communities, and they contracted these debts, and it was like a big deal. Usually there was in order to repay this, there was a subcontract in certain market squares or mining, I don't know, something like that. It was all a big political game, and in all of this you cannot say that there is any ideal. What ideal can there be, right? You can't look at politics or war and saying, we do this for moral reasons. You do this for the contingency, right? Because surely there are moral reasons, and all these people were moral in their own way. These people truly believed in important values. They had a sense of honor, of great moral resilience, but you can't. This happened exactly because they were inserted into a context that was so brutal that they didn't have basically any defense, but having massive attributes, let's say, to cope with the situation. But the political, social, economical logics were the ones that they were, right? And naturally, everybody took advantage of the possibility, and that's an intelligent thing to do. Because what's the point of an ideal if it doesn't work, right? You have to get somewhere with that. And in general, we can say that fairly say that in Europe, mercenaries or stipendiaries, as they were also called, were generally reliable throughout this period. There is no evidence that a mercenary knight would do something different from a feudal knight. They were mostly coming from the same background, or even if where they weren't, they had a bit the same ambitions at the end of the day. They did their job. That's it, right? The greatest success of the French monarchy is achieved in northern France against the English at the beginning of the 13th century, thanks to mercenaries, right? Philip II had got rid of all the French noblemen the feudatories, sending them in the south against the Cathars to go their bloodbath, and in that hell that actually southern France was. In fact, most of them, including Simon de Montfort, would die in the process. That was a freaking clever move, right? And probably even contributed at a point to the development of the monarchy within France. A bit like, I don't know, the War of the Roses wiped out the most of the House of the Lords, and this favored also the decentralizing capabilities of the Tudors afterwards. So the modern war soldier actually derives from one of the words used for the mercenary in the period. That means that is solidarius, which means he who serves for pay, for the solidus, right, for the coin, as was called the currency. And solidarius, or stipendiarius, because when they began to receive a stipendium proper, that is a salary, right? So it's actually very simple, even in the concept of miles, but here we will have to talk about it very clearly in the etymology of the term. It's because it was paid with properly with a salarium, with grains. Since the seizure vei, that's where it starts in Latin to have the miles in the sense that it was a guy who was properly paid as a soldier. So it wasn't even the ideal citizen, a peasant. Well, yeah, technically was a peasant soldier, in fact, but as a soldier, not as a guy that has to serve for nothing, right, or just for defending the homeland. No, you have to start to properly equip them, because let's be honest about this. At this point, also, yes, the equipment starts being important, but the real expense altogether is actually feeding you, your servants, your horse, or your horses, actually, because they had also more than one. Those animals eat a freaking amount of stuff, and not just random one. You have that are very delicate. I mean, they're very resilient, but also they're very delicate. You have to make them eat specific stuff, fresh stuff, and that is a huge cost. If you look at the logistical cost of a medieval army, just compared to an ancient one, you remain speechless. How the hell did they make it work for the means of those times? Right? These were incredibly bulkier and more expensive armies than previous times. The development of feudal cavalry was something astonishing, to say the least. I mean, if you just calculate the liters of water that they had to drink, how they had to empty entire rivers. It's something incredible. Sometimes I calculated the thing. They had to spend all the freaking day going back from the river to the camp in order to satisfy all those men and animals. But it's really that wild, and that also explains why making war was such a big deal. It was fairly, I mean, at least the larger expeditions were something extremely expensive, and they couldn't be done often. So rates of pay were steadily on the increase throughout his era. By the beginning of the 12th century, mercenary knights in England, for example, were being paid 6 pence a day, rising to 8 a day by 1162, 1 shilling a day by 1163, as much as 2 a day by the early 13th century, and at 3-4 shillings a day by Edward I's reign at the end of the 13th. So you understand here the increase, right? This has naturally to do with both the increase of cost of life broadly meant, but also because of the actual heavening of the gradual heavening of the panoply, but also the dynamization of the war market. There were ever more of these guys, and they had a power on their own, right? So if you didn't hire them, your neighbor could do, and also they would compete with each other. There was naturally also they were ever more capable. Consider this too, as we're saying, collective training, which is the single most important thing in the history of warfare over any other single aspect conceivable, is something increasing in these centuries. So much that is reflected in, even in tactics. What an 11th century knight tendentially fought like, still was this most the lance that was thrown as a big javelin, then much less direct charges. By the 13th century, there is the stereotypical, very thickly packed formation that works excellently, right? The medieval knight is the peak of professionalism and of perfection in its collective crochet line charge. This incredible order that was needed to perfect the cavalry charge, and they charged like hell, right? And they would go straight into the thing, and it's shocking to talk about cavalry warfare. I try to exemplify to you many ways. It's something unspeakable. What it means, not just naturally and obviously to receive a cavalry charge, which is something that I presume also most veterans today wouldn't be able to cope with by the slightest. And secondly, to carry out one yourself, right? To know that you're throwing yourself with that freaking mass and momentum and inertia that is able to crush you like a breadstick, right? Continuing about cost, sergeants and infantry, as it's understandable, were paid considerably less, between 2 and 6 pence a day in 1196. Still talking about England, by the way. 2 to 3 for infantry sergeants, 4 to 6 for mounted sergeants, right? While King John I paid mounted crossbowmen 7.5 pence or 1 shilling and 3 pence, depending on whether they served with 1 or 2 horses, right? So we see even in here that there was a functionalization. Here, everything was blended in a way. Never think that a knight not just didn't know how to use a crossbow, which was obvious, as knights used every single existing weapon at very best, but specifically that they wouldn't use it in battle. In fact, knights would. That could be a side weapon, a campaign weapon, together with other stuff, axes, maces, and so on. Not just a spear and a lance. But technically, they could transform into something else, right? Don't be dogmatic about, a knight is just a knight and that's just the knight. No, there are situations in which you are forced to be something else. Obviously, the larger armies are, the more you functionalize certain units in that situation. But, a knight, once again, could do literally everything. Right, it was literally the best trooper. We have actually good evidence. They often dismounted to fight. To be sent into the midst even of just... They were stormtroopers in many ways, also during sieges. But then sometimes were the only guys that you could send into the melee with devastating effectiveness, for example, without losing too much of your troops against unarmored infantry, as most infantries fundamentally were about. At least poorly armored, chopping like hell. Falchions, for example, are stereotypically associated to that's a peasant. Well, no, he was, or at least it of course derives from a certain line, but it has nothing to do with what would use it. Actually, a knight, being fully armored, would be the one who could have the capacity to close in with such a short weapon, while the less armored would actually prefer pole arms, and chopping like crazy in a bath of blood into the midst of this softly armored troopers, mostly on foot. Naturally, if they could, simply their horse could be killed, and you have to imagine literally not just the battle, because we imagine that's the typical thing, but most of these knights would be involved in any kind of violence, in any kind of context, right? Even in cities, among each other. It was it was just a violent life at so many levels. So they would fight in any situation, and the worst about it psychologically, that they were always prepared for it. That's the thing. Also, we forget it was just an utterly violent reality that we can't even process, given the natural exposure to threat of death as it was at the time. However, at prices like these, the hiring of mercenaries was an expensive business. As you understand, it was inevitable that the one real problem their employment in large numbers caused for the feudal monarch was that of finding the money to pay them, which we have seen in part with scutage and so on. But there would be ever more, articulated responses like the development of an actual administration, functionaries. It's not surprising that actually the most advanced feudal monarchies are exactly the ones that start creating something more centralistic at this time, like especially France, or just powers that have a lot of money, like the papacy, and so on. So that they used a lot of mercenaries. Famously enough, the papacy often made use of them because it was much easier. The problem was having the money. Everybody was fine in having the money to hire mercenaries. Nobody said, I prefer necessarily the bulkier feudal thing that didn't work anymore anyway. They knew they had to use consistently this kind of recruitment as much as possible. Problem, what it is, as for most things in life, money. If you don't have the money, you don't go anywhere. So, speaking of the national origin, mercenary knights were largely Flemish, French, Breton, Burgundian, Gascon, or German. Here I would make some exception actually, but in fact some other nationalities overlap also for infantry. In fact, the proportions changing over the years. We made a video about the Brabançons, for example, that were largely infantry. Brabant was famous for its infantry, for its pikemen, even though the Brabançon term actually defines generically mercenary infantry, right? It's a synecdoche for much of the 12th century in itself, especially. There were a bunch of mortiers, essentially, and they just took the name from the nationality that in part had been invested in the business of mercenary and so on, but it was a complicated thing. This happened sometimes even. There is a huge literature, for example, about all the accusations of sedition, of rebellion, but even of heresy. By the Brabançon famously happened in the 12th century as the century of heresies, of the great heretical revolt, so he attacks the bishops, the feudal lords. So also the stereotypization, for example, the fact that there were infantrymen, there were commoners, especially in these areas like France, or where there was a great sense of the nobility or aristocratic ethos, sometimes also a bit flattened the picture historiographically. But we know even here infantries were active. They had an important. They came exactly from those areas that were more dynamic, just economically speaking, the cities, the middle classes, and so on. Then there were speaking about the infantry. We mentioned the Brabançons, but also the Flemish, the Italians, the Aragonese, the Navarrese, and the Basques. Yes, because Flanders and Italy, we have said it many times, were the not just the richest countries in Europe, but per capita, but especially they had this. They had communes, especially Italy, city-states proper. They produced good infantry that would be in fact famously employed sometime. Not much, but especially the Flemish one abroad. The Italians most kept themselves from themselves, and also this broader northern Iberian area of Aragon, Navarre, and the Basque countries would produce this light infantry, right? Usually armed with javelins, right? Known as bidet, employed by France, in particular during the 13th century. And that would be a bit the progenitors of the Catalans, the Catalan infantry, the Almogavars, right? So there was this important tradition that stemmed a bit from, I will not say it, because mostly it was probably from the mountaineers of those areas, but also there was an important maritime connection as well, sometimes. where in landings, sieges, etc. Infantry gets dynamic. There's a great development even of missile troops in this context. Italian maritime republics. So it's an interesting area, often overlooked even in here. At the roots of developments that we see mostly later, but that were already there from centuries, and that's what we mostly forget. So most of these types of troops are listed in the Lateran Edict of 1179, which is the one that unsuccessfully forbade the use of mercenaries together with the crossbow, for example, famously enough. Now, why did the Lateran Council express this? Well, it was the reflection of a general political situation that had to keep things under control, to pacify, to maintain order, to maintain the stability of the elites. But concretely, these elites never thought even for a second that they would get rid of things like crossbows. Right? It's true, they were an excellent anti-cavalry weapon in many ways, but let's be honest, I mean, they were the first ones employing them. Nobody ever dreamt, no knight. You see, we have this prejudice that knights were just a bunch of, conservatives that didn't want to adapt to the new world. They were exactly the first people who pioneered new military developments. Right, this myth that the knights didn't understand infantry warfare, so they launched the senseless charges to be chopped down. This is insane. Whoever came up with this, just by studying the history of those very battles, but do you think they knew perfectly what they were running into? And they actually did an excellent job most of the time, and they kept doing it for centuries in the same way, actually, not just being defeated, but mostly winning, if you wonder why they would. But unfortunately, there is this kind of anti-aristocratic prejudice, I don't know why, that we have to have. I don't know if it's, once again, a classist prejudice, if it is just, this idea of the tyrants are evil and the rest of the people are pure, and this other nonsense. But the reality is very different. And so even the famous Lateran Council of 1179 is just an attempt to ideologically discipline, especially once again in the 12th century, the great century of heresies of the Brabant Sons, of the revolts, to discipline the masses more than else, right? Because the knight would actually, was obviously superior to a crossbowman by himself, but it's obvious that if you have entire communities, especially with commoners rebelling, they suck at cavalry, because of course they don't spend their lifetime like knights do. They don't have properly even the wealth, but they can produce crossbows, and they are many, so they can make a volume of fire. Well, that's where the problem begins. So this is an attempt to pacify the situation, but knights were absolutely fine with any kind of this stuff if it was used from their side, and it would have been stupid to do otherwise. I mean, you have an excellent measure to kill your enemy in battle, and you don't use it. The history of the world never happened. Like, it never went like this. Never. Right? There's not even a single exception. And especially in war, where what you see is basically the best can be used virtually at all time. So, but these are because everybody knows that the papacy forbade crossbow and it went unnoticed. This doesn't even contextualize think like Lateran councils that people do not even know what they are, usually, what they were called for, what they discussed specifically, and what they issued for which reason, right? That's the deal. But whatever. But the fact that mercenaries were forbade as well was a way of saying, look, let's not be, only the main power should have at least the faculty to, or the grant of using these forms of troops. If you are a rebel to the institution, if you're a dirty cadre that at Toulouse wants to autonomize himself from the Kingdom of France and the Church of Rome, you should not use mercenaries. But then if the Kingdom of France does it, well, not a problem, right? And that's pretty obvious. And that's clever, that's intelligence. That's what we forget about propaganda. People today are kind of, modern people are dumb, let's be honest. They look at medieval propaganda, which was one of the most sophisticated and intelligent and clever and effective thing altogether, so much that it works with them still today. And the first thing they say, look, this thing is weird because they didn't know what they did. History crushed them. No, they crushed the other guys. That's very different, and they crushed it in that way. Propaganda is propaganda. What do you make propaganda for? And why shouldn't you make propaganda? If that's a mean like another. If you use a gun, if you use propaganda, if you use whatever, the power of charm, it's still the same thing. You're just a person that does intelligently something intelligent. That's it. There is nothing bad with propaganda. Just people that are too stupid to understand it's one. That's the other issue, right? It's not the fault of the media. It's not the fault of dictatorships. It's the fault